Hey, it's podcast time. It's Get Geekish here. I'm Beto. That's Derek over there. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, we do this mostly every week. Sometimes we get lazy, and sometimes I'm behind on my editing. But we appreciate you for tuning in, listening, watching.
I wouldn't say, like, you know, getting sick is lazy.
Hey, you know, I care about our listeners, okay?
I'm just saying.
Well, we decided this week we're going to talk a little bit about the crossover. It's been
the multiverse of madness, not the Doctor Strange movie, but you know.
Yeah, because we're not going to dive into the Marvel universe. They've just been the ones that have kind of perfected the crossovers as of late. Like, if you haven't seen the new Spider-Man movie, spoilers, there are some cameos and crossovers that are absolutely amazing for anyone that's a fan of Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. And just about every Marvel movie you can count on numerous different crossovers. And I feel like I got to throw this out there right now because as I was looking at some of the cameos and crossovers of TV history, there seems to be a discrepancy of people that don't grasp the difference between a cameo and an actual crossover episode.
All right, so educate us then.
Yeah, like, I'm going to go this, when we're talking crossovers, I'm going to talk episodes that actually are written to where another show is a part of the show they're in. Just because you see a Bart Simpson doll on the bookshelf in the back of a Family Guy episode doesn't mean that's a crossover. Just because the Simpsons intro has Rick and Morty doesn't mean that's a crossover. That's just a cameo. They show up in it, right?
Right, or like, well, God, what was it? I mean, I
don't know what you're talking about.
My brain stopped. So, like, the 60s kind of dabbled in some of the crossover episodes, right? They did some weird ones with, like, especially the animated ones was like Three Stooges and Scooby-Doo and the Harlem Globetrotters showed up animated, and then they even showed up on an episode of Gilligan's Island. Mm-hmm. But then you got the 90s and the 2000s, which did crossover episodes kind of almost in like the multiverse type of thing. And they did that, you know, they walked with those so the Marvel universe could run. I mean, yeah, the comic books have been doing them for a while, but I mean...
See, I think what makes it different is the crossovers that a lot of the Marvel one does, is they have this franchise to pull from in this world they're building from it.
True.
So many of the sitcom crossovers that we're going to focus on were nothing short of cash grabs and trying to get people to watch other shows on networks back in the day when you had to watch TV on television when it was on every week.
Right.
Like and the Fox network in the 90s and early 2000s was probably one of the worst at this. Every show, every season had some sort of crossover from some other new show they were starting, and some of them, there's a few they're okay, but most of them were complete garbage. But
and that was kind of like that was kind of a death sentence, right? Because if they put a show on there, it was like, hey, check out this show, because not enough people are, you know, looking at it. Like, what was it? Like, I don't know if we've talked about this before because it's clicking my brain, but on Bones, they tried to do like a 2-episode arc or something like that with a show that just...
Sleepy Hollow.
Well, they did that one, and they did another one too. Sleepy Hollow at least lasted long. I never watched it, but it lasted longer than some of the other ones. The other one is like the closer, not the closer, the
Finder.
The Finder. Thank you.
Yeah, see, Bones was on Fox. It had the Sleepy Hollow, which we talked about, which to me is still one of the worst ideas for a crossover when you have a show that's about nothing but forensic science crosses over with a show about a dude that traveled through time to solve supernatural mysteries. That was a stretch. Well, I mean, like, but they did the Finder, which at least contextually in the story, the Bones crossover with the Finder kind of made sense. Like, you could tell it was just a grab trying to get people to watch this new show, which wasn't that good. But in the context of the show, you could see it kind of makes sense in certain aspects. Now, another one that Fox did with Bones was a bit of a curveball when they crossed over Bones with Family Guy.
What?
Yeah, there was an episode where Booth kept running into like images of Stewie, and Stewie was giving advice and telling things how to go on. So it was this weird juxtaposition of the episode. It just felt off, but they made it make sense, because as much as you were thrown off kilter that there's Stewie from the Family Guy talking to Bones throughout the episodes. And then it turns out he's hallucinating because of a brain tumor. Brings it all back home.
Do I remember that? I think I do remember that one. Maybe I've blocked that one out.
Yeah, it was a weird episode that when all was said and done, it made I dare I say it made sense. But like throughout the episode, you're like, "Are you kidding me, Fox? Come on now! Like, just air a commercial and let's get back to the show." And what's some of the other ones they had there? X-Files had a handful of cameos. They did one where they crossed over with Cops. And that was kind of clever because it wasn't necessarily a full crossover, but they actually did an entire episode of the X-Files like it was on Cops. So that first-person jumpy camera following Mulder and Scully around to try and solve this mystery of a supernatural kind. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of a fun crossover. Like, here, we're going to do our show in the style of another show for kicks. I kind of got into that. And then on the opposite side, the X-Files then also showed up on The Simpsons. I remember that was one of the great ones where Mr. Burns was taking his medication and wandering through the night and people thought he was an alien.
Well, I mean, The Simpsons right there they've like perfected the cameos and dare I say crossovers where they've incorporated like different things, from different Fox episodes. But I mean, The Simpsons is animated, so when you're watching it, you're like, oh, it kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah, you could pull from anything and it's not off kilter. Like,
but like the things that I look at that again, like you said with the Sleepy Hollow and the Bones one, like a stretch. Like I want to say this was the Harlem Globetrotters and Gilligan's Island. Like Gilligan's Island towards the later years was struggling, so they did like the crossover things like that, and it never made sense because those people got off the island, but they didn't. So, and that's going way back, and I can only say that I've seen reruns of that, so it doesn't make sense. But I mean, one of the main ones that I kind of brought up with this one again is the whole kind of like it made sense and it made sense also because Supernatural is a far out there show. I mean, they started off kind of on the ground, and then they just went with it.
You're talking Supernatural and Scooby-Doo crossover episode?
Yeah, I am. That is I think one of the best crossover episodes on TV to date.
Yeah, we're not alone. That was the top of almost every list I looked at too of one of the best crossover episodes ever.
It is just so much fun, and it makes a lot of sense. I remember when I was first watched, Supernatural a lot. It had Scooby-Doo vibes. I'm like, oh, this reminds me of Scooby-Doo. And like I said, it was more based on like fun, let's track down the monster type of thing. And then, like I said, as the show progressed, they got way out there with stuff, and they just went with it. But yeah, the Scooby-Doo episode was just fantastic in how it was done, and they made it make sense so it still flows with the supernatural universe. Mm-hmm. But and I know you're not big into Supernatural and everything, but you watched the episode, right?
Yeah, that was one of the ones that's like. And before anybody jumps out of their seat, I don't dislike Supernatural. I just haven't watched it because I'm too afraid of the commitment I have to make because I won't be able to stop.
There is so many seasons of that show, man.
Because by everything I've heard about the show, I should love it. I just haven't been able to just go down that road to put that kind of commitment into my life.
There's so much to that show. But I mean, that episode, I think that episode got a lot of people who weren't into Supernatural, who never really watched it, to tune in. Because I mean, Scooby-Doo has been doing crossover episodes since they started in the 70s, right? Like they had...
Well, they didn't do that many crossover episodes that I know.
Or did they just have like guest stars?
Yeah, they brought a lot of guest stars, which was one of their claims to fame. Is that was kind of, I think, where the Simpsons got the ideas, because so many Scooby-Doo episodes they'd bring in and animate a famous celebrity or a group or a band or a sports team and put them in the episode, and it was like a really, really big deal. So it
well, it's kind of fun too when you're watching shows like that. I mean, and aside from the Bones, where it's like a blatant like, oh, hey, this show exists, please go watch this one, this one's cool. When the way Supernatural did it was like, it was a, hey, you already know this exists, and this exists in our universe too. So, it's like the type of thing. And that's where it kind of clicks with the multiverse is you're like, oh, okay, that exists. They're in the same realm. Mm-hmm. Kind of like what Step by Step did with, I don't remember the show.
Was it Step by Step in Full House? No, not Full House.
No. Full House did it too. Full House did it with Family Matters.
Yeah, good old Urkel came over to make, was it Stephanie feel better about having to wear glasses, or somebody have to wear glasses? Man,
Something along those lines. But it was one of those ones too where it was like both those shows were successful at the time, right? And yes, it was a cash grab. It was a, hey, people, let's check this out. And like, again, the 90s were all about that. You know, they're like, hey, these two shows are successful. Bam, check it out. Everybody's going to tune in. They're already watching TGIF as it is. So
those make sense to me too, because if it's all the TGIF shows crossing over, you've got a pretty solid grasp on who the audience of those shows is. Same if you had crossovers between different soap operas during daytime TV, like it's the same audience. It's the crossovers where you have the TGIF family show crossing over with some like TVMA horror murder mystery. Like what?
No, it's exactly it. I mean, it's the one, because we keep going back to Bones. I know there's other, especially Fox. Fox was the worst about this.
Every time you go through the list, you're like, there's another Fox show. There's another Fox show.
Fox was the absolute worst with this, with going through shows, because they were struggling, I think, in the early 2000s to try to find their staple, to try to find that show. Because, I mean, they had some successful shows, i.e. Bones. So they were trying to, like, piggyback off that success to say, hey, this is successful. I think NBC did it, too. Because, like, Grimm, I don't think, crossed over. But I remember NBC had a couple shows where they're like,
well, I mean,
hey.
it was a network TV staple because they got to market the heck out of it. Because you could hear that voice right now, couldn't you? Coming this Thursday, the epic crossover event you've been waiting for. Like,
I think you're thinking in your head, was I waiting for this?
I know I wasn't. And it wasn't just a thing, because it was recent too. I mean, Brooklyn Nine-Nine and New Girl crossed over.
Oh my God. So I was trying to think of what New Girl crossed over with, and that's right. They did. That one worked because it wasn't like a blatant, like, hey, it worked, kind of.
Yeah, it was a crossover. That was a crossover where, like, a character from the show ends up living in the same universe as another show, and okay, well, you know, that's entertaining. All right, go with that.
Well, maybe it's always been one of those ones too, where you're watching, especially as a kid, when you're watching these, you're like, these have got to exist, right? In the same one, like when the Ninja Turtles crossed over with the Power Rangers.
Oh. Power Rangers in space with the worst turtles ever.
And that, not great, but it's one of those ones you're like, cool, they're in the same thing. Why aren't they helping each other out?
If we're on a superhero route that's not Marvel or DC, we could do Phineas and Ferb when they crossed over with the Avengers.
Dude, they also crossed over with Star Wars. So
that's true, yeah. The Phineas and Ferb writers, they had a lot to work with.
They did. I mean, being a Disney property, you have the world at your fingertips, like legit.
And I mean, we look at a lot of these things, and I mean, animation, you go back to the early 60s, there was an entire series based of nothing other than a giant crossover. Remember the old Wacky Races?
Yep.
That was a 16-episode series where they just gathered every licensed animated character they could find and then threw them in a giant race against each other.
Back when Hanna-Barbera was king. But was it only 16 episodes? I feel like I've watched way more.
I think
than
there might have been
episodes.
more, but the original one, there was just the 68 series only had 16 episodes, but I think they brought it back and updated it a few times.
Well, and then you look at it too. I mean, you look at it. So those are like fun crossovers, right? And again, Fox did the crossovers, but it was like the blatant, like, hey, check out a show. Then you have movies who just try too hard, and I'm going to poo-poo on this movie real quick because it was not good. It was a letdown, and that's Space Jam 2.
You're going to mud pants all over this?
Yeah, mud butt. Space Jam New Legacy or whatever was just a blatant Warner Brothers property vomit in your eyes of like, hey, remember we have this show and 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 this show. Look, they're all right here. Okay, how many can you spot? And it's just like, okay.
I still have yet to watch the new Space Jam because I'm worried about that exact little phenomenon, but
they had some cool little moments. No, take it back. They only had like one cool moment that made me actually go, but other than that, it's most of the time it's like, okay, yeah, you own Harry Potter. Oh, cool. Yeah, you own Game of Thrones, and you threw Game of Thrones into a kids movie for whatever reason. Gotcha. Oh yeah, you're part of Wonder Woman. Okay, cool. It's just I don't know. It tried way too hard and just vomited pop culture all over you. And after I got done watching, I was like, I'm never gonna watch that again. It didn't have the charm as the first.
I feel like that might be
Jam.
a Warner Brothers thing, because I was just thinking about that when we were kind of avoiding the DC superhero crossovers, because their entire TV show universe, everything is based on crossovers.
Oh yeah.
And they went a few steps further. Instead of just having, Arrow doesn't just show up in Legends of Tomorrow, or Supergirl doesn't just show up in Batwoman. They make it so these things happen in the shows, and if you don't watch the show on a different show, you get lost to what's happening in the show you're actually watching. There's a couple of ones like with the Flash and the Arrow that if you watch the Flash and you don't go stop and watch 4 or 5 episodes of the Arrow that they crossed over with, they come back, what's going on? I have no idea what's happening.
Well, I think that's what actually got me. So, I was watching Arrow for a little bit, and then they did the crossover episode with the Flash, and that's what got me to watch the Flash for a little bit. So it did work, but at the same time, I'm like, this is too much work, and I stopped watching both of them.
Yeah.
So
I liked them both, but I stopped Arrow about season 4 or 5, and it was complicated. As soon as I had to try and think about which episode I needed to watch next from which show, I'm like, forget it, I'll just watch something else.
Well, and I mean, I guess that's good. That's kind of how it is with any superhero show or movie. I mean, you look at Spider-Verse, you might be a little lost if you hadn't seen all of the Spider-Mans to kind of know some of the things. They did a good job trying to tie in the different stuff, but had you not watched them, it might have been a little confusing. I think that's why like the simple sitcom worked of, hey, it's Urkel. Everybody knew who Urkel was. Even if you didn't watch the show, you knew who Urkel was. So when he showed up in, Full House, you're like, I'm not going to watch the show, but type of thing. And like when the Beach Boys showed up in Full House, you're like, oh, cool. Okay, this is my world here, type of thing. Making it was. I'm not saying the episodes with the Beach Boys were the greatest. They were kind of weird, but it was one of those ones where it kind of kept it grounded, and you're like, okay, cool.
I realized just this is off topic of where we got our topic. We were trying to figure out if we talked about this before. I think both of us are thinking back to our old episodes where we talked about spin-off episodes and spin-off series.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of the crossovers ended up being spin-offs, turning into spin-offs. I think that's where a lot of that confusion came from in our memories.
Well, and that's the thing, too. You're right, because like what, Mork and Mindy was a spin-off, but that spin-off was like, hey, and they went back to Happy Days for a little bit, and they did some of the crossover stuff. So yeah, you're right.
Well, one of the cameos I forgot about that was great. Did you watch Parks and Recreation?
I did.
Okay. Remember good old little Sebastian?
I do.
Do you know that he ended up in an episode of The Good Place?
Yes, actually, yes.
That was glorious.
Oh man. Well, and see, that's the thing too. Is like little Easter eggs like that work too. But it's hard, I think, when you take two properties, right, that are well known, or even one that's not well known and one that's well known, and you just try to merge them together to make something work. It's probably gonna be kind of flat. God, what Nickelodeon shows did that a lot too. I think they still do it, honestly, because I think I remember seeing previews. But like not the animated ones, but the animated did too. But that's different. But like, I think every cartoon is crossed over with a cartoon. There's one. I mean, there's G.I. Joe and Transformers. There's
Archer and Bob's Burgers.
That episode was great though. Oh, that's another one. I forgot about
that one. Worked because the same voice actor,
and they acknowledged it too.
I think he's one of my favorite voices. He voices Archer and Bob, and then he.
See, and that worked. That I forgot about that episode. It's great, but I mean, that's the thing is like animation, you don't question it, right? Mm-hmm. But like you said, when you're watching Bones and something from Sleepy Hollow, which is a supernatural, like kind of like crime fighting thing, shows up, and you're like.
Yeah, if you're going to cross over Bones, wouldn't you cross it over with House or CSI Miami or something that like makes sense in that kind of world? Like
that's like Buffy the Vampire Slayer showing up in NYPD Blue. You're like, wait a minute. Sipowicz, get over here. This girl said she saw a vampire. What?
The vampire? What is she on? Drugs?
You know what's funny is there's only a small margin of people that are going to get that reference, but
yeah, it happens. I got it. Yeah, I mean, you go back, if you literally search almost any sitcom in the past 40 years, you can probably find some sort of crossover episode or cameo.
If it is at least one character.
If it lasted a few seasons, yeah. One of my love-hate crossovers was back in the Married with Children days. They Friends fans might know that Matt LeBlanc was actually a recurring character in Married with Children.
He was?
Yep, he was Vinny Verducci. He was one of Kelly Bundy's boyfriends for a while. So they Fox decided to make a spin-off of Married with Children. Instead of having a loser, low-life, deadbeat dad that's a shoe salesman, he's going to have a friend named Charlie Verducci that is also a swindling low-life that lives in the other side of Chicago, and have a spin-off episode about him and his son, Vinny. So they had an entire episode of Married with Children of the crossover of their interactions to try and hype up the release of that secondary show. And I think it lasted a season or season and a half. But
what's funny is you look at it, right? And I would say the crossover shows, or the ones where they had a substantial cameo, not just like, hey, but like one that actually like draws attention to it. That and the quote unquote recap episodes are like just filler. They're the lazy writing of like, we ran out of something, we need to do something, we don't have enough episodes. Because I remember being a kid, I hated when my favorite TV show, like my sitcom, and the 90s sitcoms were worst, of the, you turn it on and it's oh, we're going to do this, and like they don't have a budget or something like that, so they're like, let's remember our thing, and they just play a greatest hits clip of the past seasons. You're like,
oh, the greatest hits episodes. Oh, that were the worst.
I hate those so much. And what's funny is I was watching a show called Big City Greens. It's a fantastic cartoon. It's on Disney Plus, by the way. But they made fun of those, and it was just spot on. But anyway, that's kind of what it brings to mind. Is like with the crossover ones, I feel like they were just hey, we need to make this work somehow, and
we need some filler episodes.
Yeah, it was either a filler episode or hey, we need to promote this amount. Because I mean, even if you watch the Finder episodes of Bones, it kind of throws off the rhythm of the show. Because I think it was the Finder thing was like a 2 or 3 episode arc where you're watching and you're like, this just, can we skip?
Back then we couldn't.
Right, but now you can, thanks to On Demand.
But this was pretty much just talking about, because I don't think I have a feeling of if they're good or they're bad, because there's some crossovers that are great, and there's a lot that are worthless.
Here's one that we forgot.
Oh,
the kind of Muppet crossover with Scrubs, where Elmo shows up and they kind of have JD has those daydreams about it.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a full on thing, but it's funny when you're watching. You're like, what? And again, Scrubs made it work because of the thing, or maybe I'm just biased because I love the show. But I digress.
Technically, wouldn't almost all the Muppet movies be crossovers? Because
yeah,
they're taking other stories and putting the Muppets in them. So I mean, they
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. So I mean, like, okay, do you think crossovers would still work nowadays? Do you think? I mean, because it was streaming, it's kind of maybe thrown, and especially since everything's like, Netflix has their own strings of shows, and then Amazon has their own strings. Do you think now that everything's just on demand and streaming, it's going to work as well as network TV? Do you think it would work?
They still do them, so obviously it still works to a point. But I think they have to be careful with them, because you cross over and basically people create their own universes. Marvel's got their universe, DC has their universe. Netflix could very easily have their own universe of something they go on there with it. But
you're watching an episode of you and somebody from Bridgerton shows up. You're like, what the heck?
Yeah, it's what I wish could happen to some of these streaming services, especially some of the older properties, if there's a way they could bring some cameos from actors of past shows into new ones and kind of bring it back that way after shows have already ended, I think could be kind of fun for something like
with technology, like CGI, or actually
bring in actors. Yeah.
Okay.
The CGI, I mean, that could be entertaining too. It would probably just look trashy for the budgets most of them have, but find a way to retrofit a few other characters into something, and use some old clip footage to make something really funny. But I mean, it's a marketing pitch, but at the same point, it is also fun, like the Supernatural Scooby-Doo. It was amazing. If you can find something that is a niche that fits, why not have fun with the show? Especially when the shows now could do it as a way of, we're making the show to have fun. And if they put their effort into having an extra episode that has this, it's not we've got to fill 16 episodes when we wrote 12. We got to pull this on there like it used to be. It's a lot of the writers now seem to have to be thinking ahead of time of exactly how the show is going to go. So why not have a Christmas special that crosses over with something else, or throw in some other characters from another show just to see, what would happen. Look what Marvel's animated did with the What If. I mean, those comics have been around for years, and just the idea of what would happen if this was like this. I could see that working with a lot of different sitcoms and universes, and it's a much cooler way of asking what if it would be if this was the question than, oh, this happened, but it was all a dream.
Oh my God, those are the worst too. Oh man. I don't know. I think maybe the time of the crossovers in that and sitcom world and everything like that have kind of come and gone, but I don't know.
I just think you're hard pressed to find many sitcoms now that have a big enough audience that a crossover would actually work with.
Well, I just think you're hard pressed to find a show that a lot of people are invested in, especially with streaming now. Like the shows last 2 to 3 seasons and they're done. And some of them struggle to get off the floor as it is. And I think it's kind of hard because you don't have that 4 staple networks anymore, right? Mm-hmm. You have the network TV, and then you have all these streaming services that are doing their own things, and they have their own actors and everything like that. And I think now it's just a little bit more twisty and turny and wibbly wobbly, if you will, to kind of get a crossover to happen. You look at Doctor Who working with what's the
Torchwood?
Yeah, thank you. Working with that one, it worked. Same kind of universe, same kind of stuff. Scooby-Doo, Supernatural, same kind of universe, same kind of stuff, right? Type of thing.
I think I have not a solution necessarily.
Oh,
but the problem with a lot of the shows, especially the ones that we watch now with streaming, everything is so timely and based because you're binging it or the episode's leaving a cliffhanger. Mm-hmm. Back in the sitcom days, episodes were 24 minutes long. There was an intro, there was an opening, there was a problem, there was some drama, and then everything ended up happy. And then
unless they did the to be
and the episode was over. So the rest of the world could be the other way. But almost every show you watch now, you get to the end credits, and either you're already watching the next episode or you're drooling for it to happen next Monday because something's about to happen, and you can't mess up that continuity. Like, oh yeah, Black Widow's hanging from Hawkeye's hand off the edge of a cliff. What's going to happen? Oh, by the way, on Tuesday, catch Black Widow in this crossover and this other thing. She's going to be making cakes with Leslie from New Girl. Like, no, she's about to die.
I think it takes some of the suspense away too, because that was one of the things. I mean, remember when TV was huge about not necessarily incorporating other episodes, but they'd have those stingers at the bottom that would show up when you're watching, and it would say like, hey, new episode of this on Tuesdays, and then it would go away. And then for whatever reason, sometimes it just got bigger, and then some shows started to acknowledge that because they knew exactly when it was going to pop up. They're like, okay, nope, take your time. All right, it's done. So it's like kind of breaking the fourth wall there. You're like, what? Wait a minute.
And you go back and watch it now, you're like, what is this all about?
What are they talking about? A talking dog, what? I don't know. I just think it'd be, I think like your solution might work, but I think it's a little hard pressed because of the way that the streaming thing is. It'd be weird. You're sitting there, I don't know, watching, I don't know, like, what's the thing? You're watching The Witcher, right? And all of a sudden a Squid Game pops up. And you're like, wait, what the heck? Obviously that's not going to happen because Witcher's its own little IP, but still, it's still kind of...
See, somebody, maybe it should be me, I should get rich doing this. Somebody at Netflix should start writing some of these things into the stories where it's not a crossover necessarily, but say, we'll take Stranger Things and Squid Game. Oh, not Stranger Things. What's another recent... Something on there. Whatever. I can't think of specific shows that would work, but you write something to the story where they're watching another show that's airing on Netflix as part of the show, and then the very end of it or something, they're talking about it or something like that as a way of like they're in that world too, but they're watching the same thing you are as a way of promoting it, but not making them be a part of that other show.
Yeah, but I think you just nailed it on the head when you're sitting there. You're like, I can't think of another show right now because everybody is... they binge what they want to binge. Like, and it works too because I don't think, there's those collective shows that everybody watches, but it's not like back in the 90s where it was like, again, 4 network channels where everybody was watching. type of thing. Now it's kind of like you have it's cliques in high school all over again. You have the people who watch these shows. You have the people who watch these shows. Sometimes they cross over with the one show, but most of the time it's like, ew, I don't watch that show. Type of thing.
I realized I watch far too much science fiction because I'm trying to think of two shows that take place in the same time period that have the same use of technology, and I can't do it.
And that's the thing too, is I was sitting there, was like, Bridgerton wouldn't work with Squid Game, because that's a Witcher. No, because that's something.
She's
Stranger
looking at her
Things.
magic cauldron and what's going to happen next week on Squid Game? Come here, Geralt.
Oh man, yeah. See, I was going to ask, would you want to see crossed over for shows, but I just don't think it would work. I don't. Maybe somebody's going to prove me wrong. All right, so prove me wrong. What shows do you think would work great crossed over? And keep in mind that it's probably going to have to be a Netflix show with a Netflix show. It can't be like a Netflix with Amazon because they don't play nice with each other.
Yeah, you got to get shows that'll play nice together. That's the only stipulation. That's your job. Go to our social media pages and tell us a modern crossover that could happen and should happen.
And what was one of your favorite crossover episodes from the aughts in the 90s? The aughts. That sounds so weird. We're so old.
Well, I heard some kids referring to the 1990s as the 19th century. I wanted to bang my head against a wall.
Sipowitz!
All right, well, let us know at Geekish. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will talk at you next week. Hey, thanks for listening. We truly appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. Find us on social media at Get Geekish, and if you want more podcasts, we got plenty of them.